Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Community Forum show, and it's special in the fact that we have two wonderful guests available. Um, First one is Rabbi Jonathan Hausman from the Ahava Torah congregation here in Stoughton, and second, from long distance, we have retired Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, direct from Jerusalem, Israel. And good morning to both of you, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Morning.
Okay, Rabbi Hausman, if you have some comments or a beginning for this conversation, that would be very helpful.
Well, as everybody knows, Israel seems to be one of the centers of attention for diplomacy and media year in and year out, probably far outside the size of Israel and its population. But here we are nonetheless, and Ambassador Ettinger has been at the center in many ways of this dynamic relationship that the United States and Israel has developed shortly after Israel's founding in 1948. We are at a state in U.S.-Israel relations that we're talking about partnerships in many, many ways. And this is the main focus of what we will discuss today, although we'll spin off into a couple of other areas as well. So, Ambassador, Israel just concluded elections a few weeks ago. The negotiations are underway to form the next government. There are a number of successful conclusions with negotiations with some of the parties, but the government has not been completely formed at this point in time. Where do you see the potential of U.S.-Israel relations as the next government takes formation and presumably Netanyahu will become prime minister again?
Well, the bottom line is that whether the next prime minister is going to be right of center, center, or left of center, is going to be a pro-U.S. prime minister. We have very little in the national consensus in Israel, but it's mostly attitude towards the U.S. We have pro-Russian, we have pro-Ukraines, we have pro-Europe, we have anti-Europe, but when it comes to the U.S., left and right are united around the realization that the U.S. is the number one friend, ally, most trusted country in the world as far as Israel is concerned. Moreover, there is a vested American interest in Israel, and that interest transcends certain disagreements. The current administration in Washington considers the Palestinian issue to be the number one issue in the Middle East, the crux of the Arab-Israeli conflict, a core cause of Middle East turbulence, a crown jewel of Arab policy makers, all of which has nothing to do with the real Middle East. But irrespective of how does the administration view the Palestinian issue, how does it view the Israeli attitude towards Palestinians, for the US, Israel has become, in recent years, in the last 40, 30, 20 years, and more so in the last few years, the number one economic, commercial, and defense multiplier anywhere in the world. In many respects, we have become a critical element in the U.S. pursuit of groundbreaking, innovative, commercial high-tech or commercial technologies and defense technologies. For the U.S., Israel is a battle-tested laboratory of its defense and aerospace industry. we are grateful, immensely grateful for the U.S. for providing us with the necessary military systems to defend ourselves against enemies in this very unpredictable, violent, intolerant, anti-Western environment, otherwise known as the Middle East. But while the U.S. provides those military systems, we return in kind. In fact, we return a few 100% return on investment through our use of those systems, which unfortunately we have to use every single day. We share with the manufacturers, we shared with the U.S. Armed Forces, our lessons. Those lessons save the U.S. defense and aerospace industries 10 to 20 years of research and development, which amounts to billions of dollars. Those lessons are integrated as upgrades into the next generation of the U.S. military systems, and that enhances U.S. competitiveness in the global competition, which increases U.S. exports, which again amounts to a few billion dollars. And there are many other such returns on the U.S. investment in Israel. Just one last example, we have in Israel over 200 giants of the American high-tech industry, which established in Israel research and development centers. They do that because of the brain power in Israel, and those development centers have bolstered U.S. commercial high-tech competitiveness in the world, which once again saves the U.S. high-tech industry billions of dollars in research and development, increases exports, and expands the employment base in the U.S. And all those issues and many more issues are much more important for the U.S. than the future of Jerusalem. Will it be united? Will it be redivided? The future of the Palestinian state, of the Palestinian issue. Will there be a Palestinian state? Won't there be a Palestinian state? It has been much more important for the U.S. to leverage the Israeli potential as far as fending off threats to U.S. national security, U.S. homeland security, and bolster the U.S. economy.
You know, it's interesting, Ambassador. I remember reading in the history books, David Ben-Gurion was asked about Israel's natural resources way back at the establishment, the formal establishment of the state. And he said, what resources? We have one, Israel has one natural resource, and that's our brain power. That's our brain power. And you couple that with, I think it was Alexander Haig, and I don't remember if it's when he was still serving in the military or whether he was a Secretary of State, who said that Israel was the United States, it was equivalent to the United States battleship, right centered in the Middle East. And you put the two together, and it really speaks to the dynamism that is part of Israel's economy and Israel's democracy.
Well, in fact, the quote attributed to the late General Alexander Haig, who was Supreme Commander of NATO, then Secretary of State. Some attribute it also to Admiral Zumwalt of the U.S. Navy. The quote is that they considered Israel to be the largest U.S. aircraft carrier, which is deployed in the Western Middle East, which cannot be sunk, which is deployed, in fact, in the most critical area for national security and state of global trade. And if there would not be a Jewish state in the Middle East, then the U.S. would have to manufacture and deploy and maintain few more real aircraft carriers in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, in addition to few ground divisions, all of which would have cost the U.S. around $15 billion annually. And when you compare that saving of $15 billion to the $3.8 billion, which erroneously is being titled or perceived as foreign aid, then you realize why, in fact, this is an investment in Israel, which yields the US taxpayer return on investment of a few 100% every single year.
Yeah, I'm not so sure how many Americans really understand that as they use their smartphones, how much of the technology was developed in Israel. And maybe not founded in Israel, but at least perfected in Israel.
Absolutely.
How the medical advances that have taken place with regard to treatments in diabetes, heart disease, and things of that sort that have come out of incredible medical centers in Israel. Along with the number of generic medications that are available to U.S. consumers, saving untold amounts of money for the consumer here in the United States, produced by pharmaceutical companies like Teva Pharmaceutical and whatnot.
Well, in fact, the Director General or the CEO of Intel told recently the board of director of Intel that if not for the research and development centers of Intel in Israel, Intel would have been decimated by the global competition. And around the same time, the CEO of Microsoft mentioned that as a result of the growing impact of Microsoft's own 3 research and development centers in Israel, Microsoft has become increasingly an Israeli company. So obviously we contribute while always reminding ourselves, with all due respect to our contribution, we're still the small partner compared to the by far senior partner, the US, but it's a partnership. It's not a one-way street. It's a two-way street, which has been increasingly beneficial to the US due to Israel's very special experience in the Middle East. In the Middle East, we have rare natural water. Rain is not something which is similar to what you are blessed in the Massachusetts area. And the needs for water are growing because our fertility rate in Israel is one of the highest in the world. And the way we have provided water for growing Israeli society with diminishing quantity of natural rain has been by technologies, by perfecting technologies and desalination of the Mediterranean water, by recycling sewage. In fact, Israel has provided Jordan with the water required to satisfy the needs of 1.5 million Syrian refugees who are running away from the civil war in Syria to Jordan. And Israel has provided the Jordanians free of charge that quantity of water, and it has been the outcome of the Israeli irrigation high-tech. Just to give you and the viewers an idea, in Israel, we recycle 75% of our sewage in a quality which not only meets the needs of agriculture, but also is qualified for drinking water. 75%, which satisfies almost all needs of Israeli agriculture. In the US, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 4 or 5%. And certainly in Western US, you have a dire need for more and more irrigation high tech, which has benefited plenty from recent Israeli developments.
Well, yeah, and the Israeli contribution to the building of desalination plants for water from the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California. It's something, I don't know how well known it is. I know it's known in my family, but you do have that taking place, as well as Israel's contribution to what takes place on the continent of Africa with regard to its advances in agricultural technologies. It's if Africa is going to feed its own, it is without question, it seems, a result of the partnership that many of the African countries have with the state of Israel. The delegations from Eastern Africa that travel quite regularly to Israel to become schooled in such technologies and advances.
By the way, the similar contribution has been accorded by Israel to Arabs in Judea, Samaria, which is the bank. And you can look at the data, the demographic data between 1950, when Jordan annexed the West Bank to Jordan in the aftermath of the war on Israel. Between 1950 and 1967, there was no population growth among Arabs in the West Bank due to neglect of medical and health and education and employment and transportation infrastructures. From 1967 through 1993, when Israel was in full 100% control of the West Bank, the population increase of Arabs in the West Bank was the highest in their history. And the reason was Israeli investment in medical infrastructure, health infrastructure, which, for instance, lowered infant mortality among Arabs, which was one of the highest in the world, to very low, almost as low as Jewish infant mortality. Life expectancy surged almost to the level of Jewish life expectancy. In fact, today, West Bank Arabs' life expectancy, Israeli Arabs' life expectancy is very similar to American life expectancy, all a result of the Israeli investment in medical and health infrastructure, in addition to transportation infrastructure, employment, job infrastructure, which, by the way, decreased substantially the level of emigration of Arabs away from the West Bank, for which obviously we get no credit from Western media, no credit from the UN, hardly any credit from Western policymakers.
Look, and that goes without saying, the number of universities that were established in those territories as well. There were none before Israeli administration, and what's the number? Six or seven universities serving the Arab population there. And when I'm not talking about the universities and what some people would designate as Israel within the 1967 boundaries. We're talking about in Yehuda and Shomron in the West Bank. Those territories didn't exist before the Israeli administration. Because of Israel's advancements and what it contributes to the world in terms of technology and medicine and things of that sort, Israel has really become a center for venture capitalism as well. Something that it seems that Israel, I don't know if I would say as a direct result of the Abraham Accords, but it certainly helped husband a lot of this. But what's happening in the Arab Gulf with the Amarat, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, and some of those countries that have signed the accords as well.
In fact, that brain power in Israel, which has attracted major American and Japanese and Singaporean investors to Israel has been one of the key reasons for the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, to conclude peace treaty with Israel, because the Emiratis and Bahrain, just like, by the way, Saudi Arabia, realize that the days of oil as the prime source of national income, the days are coming gradually to an end, and they're eager to diversify their economy. And they have considered Israel to be a natural partner, a perfect partner to diversify their economy through Israeli high tech. And by the way, that's commercial high tech as well as defense high tech. And that type of Israeli performance in the area of high tech goes back to the late 1990s, when Israel got into the capital venture market, the high tech market. And today, the level of investment by American mostly, but also other investors in Israeli high tech has broken all records. In fact, during COVID years, we had an all-time high level of foreign investments in Israel, mostly in Israel's high tech. And that was not a form of respect for Israel or sentiments, pro-Israel sentiments. It was a sheer outcome of interest of the high-tech companies, of the Western governments. And in fact, if you look at the level of the strength of our currency, the shekel, one of the reasons it is so strong has to do with the waves of foreign investment in Israel, which has literally flooded Israel with American dollars. Today, we have well over $200 billion foreign exchange reserve. We benefit from that, but once again, we return to the investors, we return to the US in the form of shared high-tech development, which benefits the American corporations, benefits the American employees, benefits the standard of living in the US, and it comes down to benefiting the American taxpayer.
Well, I think this is one of the results of having a stable government. People take a look at Israel's domestic scene and say, it's amazing that anything can get done. People don't get along, but Israel is a democracy. It is, as I've described it to some family members just a couple of weeks ago, it's a hyper democracy. But it works. There has been political stability in Israel all along, and with some vision and brain power, it's allowed Israel to develop in these areas. Can I ask you to comment a little bit? You know, we talk about Israeli companies that are contributing far in excess, it would seem, when you take into consideration the size of Israel and the size of Israel's economy, although Israel's economy is huge at this point in time. But the number of Israeli companies that have relationships here in the United States and listed on the stock exchange, New York Stock Exchange and Dow Jones and whatnot, it seems to be that if Israel is not the #2 country with companies listed on the stock exchanges as involvement in the United States, then it can't be much lower on the list than #3. Far and away, having more companies listed on the exchanges here than I think England, France, and Italy combined, or Germany combined, which would be the next 3 down in Europe on the list. It's just absolutely amazing, the dynamism here and the growth here. And I think this really speaks to the relationship as well.
Well, it speaks to the relations, but it also speaks to the unique nature of Israel, which is an outcome primarily of our background as a Jewish state. And Jews have always, throughout the centuries, emphasized education, education, and education. But more than that, we have an environment which adds to the need to develop and to defy natural challenges, to defy military challenges. We have no choice. You look at the defense industries in Israel, the level of our defense industries reflects the challenges faced by Israel in the face of American military systems, which are sold to Arabs around us, Russian military systems, Chinese military systems, European military systems. We have to outdo all those systems if we want to stay alive. And hence, we develop response to those systems. Due to our very special ties with the US, we have shared most of it with the Americans. More recently, we developed very unique air defense system against incoming missiles, the Iron Dome, before that, the Arrow system, all of which has been developed in a joint manner with the US. The development is fully by Israel, but then some of the funding of the development has been American. Much of the manufacturing has been an American. And once again, it's an example of the two-way street. And that, by the way, adds on to the historical common denominator, which has bonded us, the US and Israel, for many, many years. In fact, Friday, a week ago, the US celebrated Thanksgiving. More and more Israelis, by the way, are now also celebrating Thanksgiving with turkey. And very few Israelis, I venture to say probably very few Americans, realize that Thanksgiving has Jewish roots. You go back to the first time it was celebrated, November 1621, by William Bradford of the Mayflower, and he announced the celebration of Thanksgiving by reading the 107th chapter of Psalm, which is the foundation of Jewish gratitude to God, gratitude to fellow human being, gratitude to the family, etc. And in fact, he based it also on the Jewish tradition of the holiday of Tabernacle, the holiday of Pentecost, which are based again on expressing gratitude. But again, the foundation were Jewish foundation, which is one of the many, many examples of the very solid ideological, historical foundation binding together the American culture and the Israeli culture.
Yeah, Hodu Lashem Ki Tov Ki Le'olam Chasdo, right?
It's,
Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good and his mercy endures forever.
right. And in fact, William Bradford, who was known to be well-versed in the Old Testament and was well-versed in the Hebrew language, upon his death, on his tombstone, there are 3 Hebrew letters. God supports me throughout my life. And that was written in Hebrew, again, testimony to the respect by William Bradford, one of the 2 leaders of the Mayflower, to the Jewish foundation.
Well, and people should know that so literate were the founders of the United States that the early universities here, many of them have Hebrew on their crests. Harvard does, Yale does. Those are just two examples.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, in the old days, the first 10 universities taught Hebrew. In the old days, presidents of universities were well versed in Hebrew. One especially was the president of Yale University. I think it was 1790 through 1800. His name was Ezra Stiles. And he was not only a professor of chemistry and astronomy and philosophy, but also a professor of Hebrew. He spoke, read, and wrote in Hebrew, communicated with Rabbi Chaim Karigal from Hebron, and he was known with his departure saying to graduate students, you would do much better knowing how to recite Psalm in the original language, because that's what Saint Peter will expect out of you in the gates, in pearly gates.
I will tell you just a side story. We had some family friends with whom we were very close, like you know, and you ever have friends who were like aunt and uncles to you? Well, not Jewish, actually practicing Catholics. I was asked to give the eulogy for both of these people, and at one of them I started to recite Mishlei Lamed Aleph, Proverbs 31, and I said, I don't think anybody here is going to understand this because I'm going to recite it in Hebrew. And then I turned around, you know, and I said, well, he'd understand me. It was the original language, and to be honest with you, there were some of the universities in the 17th and 18th centuries here in the United States in their formative stages. People should know that the required languages of study happen to have been not only English, but Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Required languages of studies.
In fact,
Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, they were all literate in Hebrew, all of them.
Some of the leaders of the abolitionist movement were also leaders of the Hebraist Society, which strove for Hebrew as a second official language. One of them was Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and her husband, who was nicknamed the Little Rabbi because he was short in height, but very, very tall in the grasp of biblical knowledge. And they based much of their battle against slavery on the Mosaic tradition, and simultaneously they contended that Hebrew should be part of the American culture. You can see the impact, by the way, on the Liberty Bell. The Liberty Bell, which is the role model of American concept of liberty, has a verse inscribed on the Liberty Bell, and it's Leviticus 25, verse 10, proclaim liberty unto all the earth and unto all the inhabitants thereof. Again, testimony to the ties between Jewish history and American history.
And you know, following the Civil War, it happened to have affected a lot of the interactions between the Jewish population here in the United States and the recently freed slaves, black population here in the United States, such that entire school systems were established by Jews using Hebrew as part of the language, or one of the languages of instructions, to help uplift blacks out of poverty and begin to help them become more participatory in the future of this country. It seems to be something that's been ignored over the past few decades, but a whole series of schools known as the Rosenwald schools. And for those people who know of, you know, great leaders in the black community like Martin Luther King Jr., he was schooled at Rosenwald schools. He was, I wouldn't say as literate in Hebrew as you or I, but he certainly could read the language and understand a lot of it. And look at the effect that he had. I want to pivot back to something with regard to Israel and aid that Israel receives from the United States. There has been in certain quarters a lot of criticism regarding the amount of military aid that Israel receives from the United States. And people mistakenly believe that this is aid that is literally sent from Washington to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. But in fact, most, if not all, of the aid that Israel receives from the United States, and is strictly military aid at this point in time, as I recall, must be spent here. So Israeli brain power coupled with American economic might equals American jobs. And it just, like I said, there were a number of people in Congress and without that seem to lose this within the din of arguing pro or critical arguments regarding Israel and Israel's contribution to the world, contribution to the United States.
I'll share with you a personal experience. I visit Capitol Hill a few times a year, and one of my recent visits was to an office of a congressman from the district of Chattanooga in Tennessee. And he mentioned to me that a few years ago, Israel decided to buy a robot which Northrop Grumman manufactures in his district. It's a robot that neutralizes explosives. And according to the congressman, the minute it became known throughout the world that Israel decided to choose that robot for its day-to-day combat against terrorism, that served, as he defined it, as a AAA store for his district, because throughout the world they concluded that robot must be the best in the world, because Israel cannot afford but to choose the best means to combat day-to-day terrorism. And as a result of the Israeli decision to buy the robot, exports from the Chattanooga district zoomed right away, and later on resulted in many worthy lessons which upgraded the product and its next second generation, which further increased the exports. Now, that's a small robot. If you think about the combat aircraft, American aircraft, which we use, the F-15, the F-16, the F-35, Israel always gets it a few years before the first American dogfight. Namely, before American combat pilots use the American planes in a dogfight, they get years of Israeli experience shared with the American Air Force, which makes the performance of American pilots that much more advanced than it would be without the battle-tested laboratory, otherwise known as Israel. But as far as the economy, strictly speaking economy, the Israeli battle-tested laboratory provides hundreds of operational and maintenance and repair lessons to the manufacturers, which again are integrated as upgrades into the combat planes, and that amounts to mega billion-dollar bonanza for the manufacturers, which expands the employment base of those industries. The same way the research and development centers of the American high-tech giant contribute to American employment and American exports. Obviously, Israel would not be able to make it without the American military systems, but we return in kind. And in fact, when you measure in dollar terms the value of the return on the American investment, it is a few times higher than the $3.8 billion, which erroneously is referred to as foreign aid.
I want to, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to put 3 topics on the table for comments, because I think they need comments. One is the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which existed, then was negotiated under the Obama administration, pulled under the Trump administration. Negotiations are taking place again to have some kind of update to it under the Biden administration. That's number one. Number two, the United Nations. Just recently, over the past couple of days, the UN passed a resolution in the General Assembly apologizing for the Nakba in Israel's establishment. And number three, we can't get away from this, at least from the those of us who live here, who are Jewish and live here in the United States, the increase in anti-Semitism. Jews are being accosted on the streets, let alone what's happening to Jewish properties here, synagogues and things of that sort. What's the view from Israel on all 3 of these issues? As Israel, listen, it's difficult, but Ambassador, we can't let the hour go by without touching on these 3 things.
No, absolutely, absolutely. The question is, how many hours do we have to discuss even the first one, the negotiation with Iran? Because
we have 13 minutes approximately, okay, so we're going to have to do the Reader's Digest version.
That's plenty. When it comes to the negotiation with Iran, U.S. negotiation with the Ayatollah's regime in Iran, it is a reflection of U.S. policy towards Iran since February 1979, when the Ayatollah's regime took hold of control of Iran, toppling the regime of the Shah, who was America's policeman in the Gulf. The belief by the U.S. administration then, President Carter, and throughout the years, has been that the diplomatic option is the right way of dealing with the Ayatollah's regime. The fact is that since 1979, the U.S. stuck to the diplomatic option, and the outcome has been unprecedented, robust tailwind to the Ayatollah's regional and global campaign of terrorism, drug trafficking, smuggling of military systems to anti-American societies and regime, collaboration with drug traffickers, money laundering, and not only in the Persian Gulf and not limited to the Middle East or West and North Africa, but all the way to Latin America, from South Chile all the way to the US-Mexico border. You have well-documented evidence of entrenched Iranian presence in conjunction, in collaboration with a major Mexican, Colombian, and Bolivian drug cartels, with the major terror organizations in the US, exporting to drug cartels special equipment, Iranian equipment, designed to construct underground tunnels, as they do between Gaza and Israel, between Syria and Lebanon and Israel. They want to do the same thing between Mexico and the US. They've exported to Venezuela the very, very top Iranian Predator unmanned aerial vehicles, and all that under the wings of the American diplomatic option. And it seems to me that it's time for the US to reassess its policy and determine whether continuation of diplomatic option could yield anything but further bolstering of the anti-American policy by the Ayatollah's regime. It seems to me that for the sake, first and foremost, of majority of Iranians who are eager for regime change, the US should visit a regime change option, a military option, knowing that there may be certain cost of US military option not occupying Iran, but destroying the infrastructure of Iranian pursuit of military nuclear capabilities, of Iranian military ballistic industries, and Iranian infrastructure of terrorism. That would be a blessing to the majority of Iranians. It would be a tailwind to every one of America's pro-US Arab Sunni regimes. It would advance America's own interest, and it seems to me that it's time to reevaluate the current American policy rather than keep pursuing a self-destructive policy towards Iran.
What did Einstein say? Definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results.
Right. Absolutely.
It seems in terms of this aspect of international diplomacy, as my father would have said, been there, done that, time to move on, need a different model.
Absolutely.
Regarding the resurgence of anti-Semitism here in the United States, I mean, those of us who have been following this throughout our lifetimes, I have to be honest with you, what I see today is not much different than what I experienced as a child growing up. But depending upon where you live, the effects seem to be much sterner. So what kind of reporting is taking place in Israel with regard to this? What are Israelis discussing with regard to really the worldwide resurgence of anti-Semitism? You know, it's out from under the sheets and no longer in polite company anymore.
Well, obviously, it does reach the headlines in Israel, and headlines always tend to highlight that which makes news. Namely, a headline would take a rotten tree and imply indirectly that it's not only a rotten tree, it's a rotten orchard, which is absolutely wrong. And I think you were correct in assessing that it's not much different than your youth in the US. I remember studying in the US for my undergraduate and graduate in the late 1960s, early 1970s. There were major concern about anti-Semitism, major concern about anti-Israel sentiments on American campuses. And in fact, some people claimed that that means that in a few years, there will not be close ties between the US and Israel. Objectively speaking, I think we have to contend with the fact that anti-Semitism has been with us throughout the ages for 3,000 years, 3,500 years. And certainly when you compare American anti-Semitism to European anti-Semitism, the European anti-Semitism is much, much, much more destructive and serious phenomena than it is in the US. In the US, indeed, there are few rotten trees, few rotten elements in the overall very blossoming orchard of peaceful coexistence between Christians and Jews, between Americans and Israelis. And we should not allow ourselves to be misled by those rotten trees into assuming that we are talking about a rotten orchard, especially when we find out about the very wholesome cultural, historical, ideological foundation between the American society and the Israeli society. And certainly, when you look at the Christian reaction to explosive anti-Semitic eruptions in the US, the overall Christian reaction does bode well for future relations between Christian and Jews in the USA.
Well, and there are many organizations, Christian organizations, that are really standing shoulder to shoulder with Jews, not just here in the United States and in Canada, but throughout the world. Organizations like Pastor John Hagee's Christians United for Israel, Pastor Dumasani Washington's the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. And those are just two examples. They're just two examples, including the sea changes that have taken place in the evangelical Christian communities like Assemblies of God and things of that sort. Just this, there's been a sea change over the past 50 years with some of these denominations, to be sure.
Absolutely, but at the same time, we certainly should not be complacent whenever there are such eruptions, and it calls for more and more resources to educate people, Jews and Christians, about the commonality of the two religions, about the contribution of Judaism to the overall society. When you study Judaism from the incept of the patriarch Abraham until today, Judaism never, but absolutely never, had any intention to bring the non-Jews to submission. Judaism never had any megalomaniacal, imperialistic vision of ruling, controlling the world. The Jewish vision has always been sharing and contributing and enhancing the welfare of the entire human race, and it continues until today with the Jewish state, which is demonized by the UN, but at the same time shares its knowledge with third world country in a way which exceeds anything that the Europeans are doing in Africa or in Asia. And again, many times we do it in conjunction with our American partners.
I heard one pastor who has founded a very significant ministry here in the United States. He's now global, say one time to his flock. I was at his church in Greater Detroit, 7,000 people on a Sunday morning, and I was there to speak. And this pastor got up and said, you know, the Jews can live perfectly well without us, but we cannot live without the Jews. Everything that we are comes from them. They are the wellspring. It was an amazing thing. It was an amazing thing for a rabbi to hear. I have to be honest with you.
Right. Well, but I would suggest it's a two-way street,
without question,
mutually beneficial, and we should promote that two-way street-like mentality and effort, not to lose sight of the mutual threats and the mutual challenges which we experience.
Yeah, and I can't tell you how many pastors say to me often, ask me often, what is it about Jew hatred? What is it about anti-Semitism? I don't understand it. And I always have to respond by saying, you know, this is the problem. This is the problem of reading what you would call the Old Testament in translation. Because there's a little piece of a pasuk, a little piece of a verse that says, Esav l'soneh Yaakov. You know, it just says that Esau hates Jacob. And I've said to a number of pastors, it doesn't say why, doesn't give you the reason. All it states is 4,000 years ago, there was that hatred there. That's it. It exists. And you can ascribe just about any kind of reason you want to it. Spiritual, economic, political, whatever you want, but it just exists. who was the one who said that anti-Semitism is the constantly mutating virus? It could have been Natan Sharansky, it could have any number of people, but that happens to be true. Yes, vigilance is the price we have to pay. Vigilance is the price we have to pay.
I think it may be also the historical Jewish resistance to lose our unique traits, to avoid assimilation in a way which will undermine our own roots. And some people mistakenly assume that this is a sense of superiority, while in fact, it's not superiority, it's the realization that we have such a unique legacy, which has contributed so much to humankind that it would be reckless to abandon that legacy. But never in Jewish history have we employed that clinging to our roots as a means to assume superiority. Superiority on the one hand and Jewish tradition on the other hand are a contradiction in terms.
Ambassador, we have about 60 seconds left. Is there any last word you would care to share?
Well, the only advice I have for our viewers and for ourselves is stick to reality and never sacrifice reality, as frustrating as it may be, on the altar of wishful thinking. Wishful thinking may be convenient in the long run, but suicidal or self-destructive in the long run. In the short run, you may be very complacent with convenient wishful thinking, but don't give in and don't abandon the study of reality, Middle East reality, American reality. We have a lot to be proud of: American reality and Israeli reality, Jewish and Christian reality, and we should cultivate those realities.
We'd like to thank this morning Ambassador Yoram Ettinger for joining us in a very fascinating conversation over this last hour. Ambassador, I'm going to extend an invitation from the synagogue next time you're here in the United States. Let's see if we can get you here to Stoughton so people can actually meet you face to face.
I would welcome such an opportunity, which would be a repeat, I believe, of what I did.
Indeed, it would be. Let's see if we can get the same numbers for you.
Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Rav Todot.
תודה רבה.